psychological wellbeing practitioner, and in today's video I'm hopefully going to be providing you with some tips and guidance on how you can secure a trainee psychological wellbeing practitioner role. Just as a disclaimer before I get into the video, this video is not going to guarantee you a job. I wish it would, but unfortunately, all I can offer you is some tips and some guidance. I'm going to offer you some tips which I found extremely helpful for me in my personal journey towards becoming a psychological wellbeing practitioner, and hopefully this video will just allow you to be readily equipped and prepared for the application process, the interviews, and how to secure that training role. I really wish I could wave a magic wand and automatically get you onto the role, but unfortunately all I can offer you is this video. So I'm sorry that it can't guarantee you a job, but I do hope it helps in some way regardless. So let's just start off and think about what actually is a trainee psychological wellbeing practitioner. Now in this video I'm going to refer to the job role as a PWP because it is a bit of a mouthful. So a PWP works in an IAPT service, and IAPT stands for Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, and the clue's in the name as to what it kind of does. So it's a movement that has been set up within the UK to allow people to access quick short-term therapy. It helps to reduce the long waiting times, and it also tries to reduce the demanding resources required for psychological treatments. So in order to provide someone with the least resource intensive but the most effective treatment, IAPT utilises a stepped care model. So the stepped care model is a model within IAPT that allows a healthcare professional to use their clinical judgment to decide which treatment option is the most appropriate for the patient but the least intrusive. So a PWP will work at step 2 on the stepped care model. And that means that we will work with people displaying mild to moderate mental health presentations, and we can offer guided self-help based on the principles of cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT for short. Within this guided self-help, a PWP will try to empower the patient to learn skills and techniques to manage their own mental health difficulties and maintain their well-being. So a PWP can deliver those treatments, but they can also triage and assess to see what level on the stepped care model a patient would be suitable for. So as a PWP, we can conduct an assessment, and if we decide that the patient is showing more moderate to severe mental health presentations, then you could put them forward for step 3 on the model. So whilst a PWP primarily works at step 2 on the model, you can use your clinical judgment to decide if you think a patient is more appropriate for a different step on the model. Training as a PWP is really great for your clinical experience. It's very clinically focused. So within my personal training, I had 1 university day and the rest was working in the service. And all of the assessments included within my training as well was very clinically focused. So for instance, I would have to have my clinical practice observed by assessors. I would also have to record myself delivering treatment to get it marked. And a lot of my reflective essays were all based on cases I had worked with and my clinical practice. So it really gets you stuck into clinical experience. So that's basically what a PWP is in a nutshell. If you do have any questions about that or something that I've not explained clearly, then I would encourage you to write in the comments or send me a question, and I will be happy to answer more information on that. But the next step we're going to talk about is, how do I start? How do I become a trainee PWP? How do I get onto the training? So the main thing to note is that there are normally 2 PWP intakes for training each year. Those that start in March and those that start in October. That is normally when the PWP training will start and when the university course will start. So you want to start looking for jobs a few months before the courses start. So for instance, I started my training role in the October, but I was job searching for trainee PWP vacancies in the August. So you want to look a bit beforehand. I found my job on NHS Jobs. I know that you can also look at Indeed and other job vacancy websites. If there's a particular training program that you want to become a PWP with, then you can look at the university website as well. Look for the postgraduate certificate in low intensity interventions, and the university will normally tell you how you can get onto that training. So for instance, my university displayed on their course information that you needed to secure a role through the service first before you could apply to the university. So I applied for the job within my service, got accepted within my service, and then they put me forward for the interview at the university. So that's how it worked. So I went through the traditional service route. There are also private companies which offer PWP training as well, but unfortunately I don't have experience with that because I did mine with the IAPT service within the NHS. So I would encourage you to inquire about that. If there's a service in particular that you know is doing the PWP training, network with them, definitely inquire about that and see how you can get on board with that. So in terms of knowing when you're ready to apply for a trainee PWP role, most types of clinical experience are relevant. Anything that's patient facing is enough. If you've worked in a healthcare setting, if you've worked as a nurse, if you've volunteered somewhere, anything that is patient or client facing that you have experience in, either voluntary or paid, that would be relevant. The main thing to focus on is the transferable skills. So regardless of whether you've done a psychology degree, regardless of whether you've been in the psychology industry or you haven't, as long as you've got transferable skills that you can show why it's relevant for the PWP role, then that is enough to apply. One of the main pieces of positive feedback that I got from my interviews was that I showed how working in retail had transferable skills that I could use to benefit the PWP role and that I could bring to that role. Retail's completely unrelated. So obviously I did have clinical experience as well, but you can look at transferable skills, and as long as you can display them in your application and why they would make you a great PWP, then that is the main thing. Now, what do you include in the application? So obviously I can't tell you exactly what you can include, and it is different for each service and each training course. Your best friend will be the job description or the person specification, as that will tell you exactly what skills they're looking for. If you can tailor your personal statement to those key points, and if you can display why you hit all of those points, then that's probably the best way to go about it. You must also draw on previous experience to show how you hit that person's spec. Like I said earlier, try to use clinical experience if you can, but if not, transferable skills. Just display how you have transferable skills that you can take from your previous roles into the PWP role. And you can also talk about skills that you've learned in your degrees as well. So if you have an undergrad or a postgrad that you've done, you can also talk about those as well, as long as they conform to the person specification and what is required as a PWP. So now I'm going to talk about preparing for interviews. So you've done the application, you've written your personal statement, and they want to invite you for interview. What do you do? Or what can you expect rather? So for my PWP training, I had 2 interviews. I had one from the service and one from the university. Both were quite similar, I'm not gonna lie. There were ever so slight discrepancies between the two, but on a general consensus, they both covered the same themes. So the tips that I'm going to talk about I think would be relevant for both the university and the service interviews. Research the history of IAPT. Why was it set up? What's the purpose of it? How does it achieve its goals to improve access to psychological therapies? And how does it fit into the NHS 5-year forward plan? Alongside this, research the stepped care model. Why is it important to use the least intrusive treatment option, but the most effective? Where does a PWP fit on the stepped care model? Specifically talk about step 2 on the model, but show an awareness of the other steps, because you will also be needing to know what the requirements are for those steps. What are the differences between the step 2, where a PWP fits, and the other steps? What are the differences? I would also recommend that you research the basic principles of CBT. So just as a reminder, that's cognitive behavioural therapy, and that is the main intervention that a PWP will be focusing on within your guided self-help treatment sessions. Now, you're not expected to know everything about CBT because you will be taught that on the training. So they're not looking at you to display lots and lots of knowledge about CBT. If you have that knowledge, fantastic, you're already one step ahead. But if you can just show that you're aware of the basic principles, you're aware of the purpose and how CBT works, then you'll be fab. If you feel confident, you could briefly talk about the 5 areas model / the vicious cycle / the hot cross bun method. People call it different things. I'm going to refer to it as the 5 areas model. This is a model that I use with every single patient that I deliver treatment to, and it is one of the main models of CBT. It sets the scene for CBT, and it's a really good way of describing how it works and what it focuses on. So if you do feel confident, you could explain the basic principles of CBT through the 5 areas model, explain the purpose and why it's relevant, why is it helpful. And then it also might be necessary to research a little bit on NICE guidelines. So that's the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. Every single intervention within IAPT conforms to evidence-based guidelines by NICE. So everything that we do has to conform to NICE guidelines. So it would be important to just briefly research NICE and just show how IAPT and NICE are linked and why we can justify the interventions because there's an evidence base behind them. So that's the research side of the interview prep, but you can't forget about the personal side as well. Why do you want the job? What skills and knowledge can you bring to the role? What do you want to develop and nurture from the role? How would you cope with stress and the high caseload demands? One piece of feedback that I got from an interview was that I didn't show an awareness of the high caseload demands of a PWP. If you weren't aware, a PWP is required to have a lot of clinical contact hours a week. It's very patient facing and sometimes it can be quite demanding. You need to show an awareness of that. How are you going to stop yourself from burning out? What are you going to do to manage your own mental well-being as well as your patients? How can you support other colleagues and make sure that the team's well-being is still being maintained? It's no secret that IAPT can be quite stressful to work in sometimes. So you need to show an awareness of the high caseload demands and you need to show that determination to be able to fulfill those clinical contact hour targets. Display how you manage stress. IAPT goes crazy for supervision. They're a very supportive service. Because they're aware of the high caseload demands, they offer you a lot of opportunity for supervision to ensure that you are being supported. So if you're able to talk about supervision, how you will use it or how you've used it in the past, then that would be really beneficial for the interview, if relevant. Why will utilising supervision help you manage the stressful caseload demands? Why is supervision important? How can supervision improve your clinical practice and also benefit the patient? And then the final tip that I think would be helpful to include in the interview would just to display an awareness of diversity. So for example, how would you support a patient who had a different spoken language to you? What adaptations could you make to accommodate for a patient who has a learning disability? How can you conform to the IAPT ethos of improving accessibility to psychological therapies for the general population, including those with diverse needs? I would really recommend that you just show an awareness of diversity and how you would accommodate for that. The next bit I'm going to talk about is a role play. Now, you may not get asked to do a role play as part of your interview. However, I was asked to do a role play and I know of other PWPs who were also asked to do a role play, so it is a possibility. So I'm only going to talk about this briefly, and I'm also going to give some tips that might just be helpful as well when you're starting off in your trainee role. So within my university interview, I got asked to separate 10 minutes out to do a role play. This role play was basically just to show that I have the adequate interpersonal skills, that I can show warmth and compassion, and that I'm good at information gathering. How are you going to get the information out of a patient who is being quite vague or potentially doesn't want to share too much, but it's necessary for them to share? Information gathering skills are really important as a PWP. So my role play was all based on how do I gather information from the patient. So the first tip to focus on when gathering information would be to focus on the 4 W's. So this is what, when, where, and with whom. This is a great starting point for gathering information. What is the problem? What brought you to the service? When does this happen? When do you feel like that? Where do you feel like that? Where does this happen? With whom is the problem better or worse? Those 4 W's are really helpful as an introduction, just to get the information out of the person from the start. So I would highly recommend that if you are asked to do a role play, you focus on the 4 W's as a starting point. Other things that you should incorporate throughout the role play would be things like open questions. So try not to ask too many closed questions where the patient is able to just answer yes or no. Yes or no is not enough information. You want detailed answers from the patient. How are you going to find out what their problem is if they're being quite blunt about it? We want to get down to the specifics. So using open questions doesn't allow their answers to be restricted. They can talk freely. They can answer your question freely. And if they do answer with a yes or a no, or they do answer quite vague, then try to explore that a little bit further with some more open questions. So, for example, some exploration phrases that I use are, I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about that. Would you be able to tell me a little bit more about that? Could you expand on that for me, please? Another tip that you should incorporate throughout the role play is to reflect and summarise. Reflections are extremely important because they allow the patient to know that you've listened to them and that you've understood. So what you're telling me is, what I'm hearing from you is, does that sound accurate? Have I understood properly? Don't be afraid to ask the patient, so you've told me this, have I understood that properly? You know, you've told me you're experiencing anxiety attacks every time you're in a social situation. Have I understood that correctly? That's their opportunity for them to say, wow, okay, she has listened, or, oh no, she hasn't quite got it and I need to correct them. Another thing that you should incorporate throughout the role play is empathy statements. So statements such as, that must be really difficult for you. I can't imagine what that must be like for you. That's understandable to feel that way given what you've experienced. So those are the main things that I would incorporate throughout the role play. You may or may not be asked to include risk. Again, if you are asked to include risk, it will just be about information gathering. They won't expect you to know the proper protocol. You won't be expected to know what the appropriate course of action is to take if you do encounter a patient with suicidal ideation. It will more be, how do you explore that further and how do you get the necessary information from that patient? So again, referring to the 4 W's. So if you ask someone within the past 2 weeks, have you had any thoughts of a suicidal nature, or have you had any thoughts to end your life? If they confirm that they have, refer back to the 4 W's. So if you come across a patient who confirms that yes, within the past 2 weeks they have experienced some thoughts to end their life, what are the thoughts? When do these thoughts occur? Where do these thoughts occur? And with whom are the thoughts better or worse? Also ask about intention to act. On a scale of 0 to 10, what would be your intention to act on those thoughts? How likely are you to act on those thoughts? And ask about a safety plan. Do you have a safety plan in place for when you do encounter those thoughts? What keeps you safe? What are your protective factors? Why wouldn't you end your life? What are your reasons for not ending your life and for not acting on those thoughts? So again, with risk, it will be similar to the information gathering in the role play. They will just want to know how you explore that further and that you don't just brush it off, and that you do get that necessary information from that patient that is so important for them. So that was the role play in a nutshell. Again, it might be relevant to you, but it also might not. Different services do different things. I'm going to talk about another thing now that was necessary for me to do in order to achieve my role on the training, but it might not be appropriate for you. So I've also been asked to do an essay and a presentation for my application. So you may be asked to do an essay or a presentation. In my experience, these have all been based along similar things as to what I've already discussed in this video. So my presentation needed to be on the reasons for IAPT. What's the purpose? What are the goals? How does it improve accessibility? I also had an essay that was around supervision. Why is supervision important? Discuss how you've used supervision to improve your clinical practice. So hopefully within this video I've already mentioned things that you could expect to be within one of these tasks. Just a quick note on my essay. So my essay was around reflection, and as I've already mentioned, reflection is really important within IAPT. Within your training as a PWP, a lot of your assignments will probably be based on reflection. So for my reflective essay, I needed to reflect on an experience where I used supervision and used that to improve my clinical practice. So in order to structure this essay, I used a reflective model. I only had 1,000 words to work with, so that didn't give me a whole lot of room. So I used the Rolfe et al. Model, which is quite simple and works really well when you do have quite a short word count. It's literally what, so what, now what. So it's basically, what was the situation? So what is the point in you talking about this? What is the relevancy? And now what are you going to do because of that? You could also use the Gibbs reflective model. So in my training, Gibbs was mainly what we used. We used Gibbs for every single reflective model, so you could also use that one. So that one is description, feelings, evaluation, analysis, and action plan. So that one's a bit longer, there's a lot more subheadings, and if you can condense that into 1,000 words, then I would recommend using Gibbs as well, because that's a really thorough reflective model. But there's loads of reflective models out there, and mine didn't necessarily say that I had to use a specific model, so I felt quite flexible in the ones that I could use. So I chose Rolfe et al., but you could use Gibbs, you could use Kolb, you could use Driscoll, use any that you are comfortable with, but it just helps you to structure the essay. And again, it will be really helpful for your training because they can see that you can reflect, you can structure a reflective essay, you can look at your competencies objectively, you can learn from mistakes, you can utilise supervision. It just basically shows how you would be good at the training for PWP, basically. So that's pretty much everything that I have to talk about in terms of how I secured a training PWP role. I hope that this has offered you some guidance and some help. I know it can be really tricky to get a trainee PWP role. It is competitive and the process can be quite complicated, and it seems to be different for everybody as well. Everybody has a different experience, but hopefully this can just help to set your expectations, and maybe you've learned something that might be quite helpful to put into an interview or to an application. I really hope so, because that was my goal. If you have any questions at all about my experience as a trainee PWP, or any questions about being a qualified PWP, or anything about psychology in general, then please, I would encourage you to message me on Instagram. My link will be in the description, or you can leave a comment and I'll reply to you. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you have any video requests, anything you want to see from me in the future, then again, please just let me know. I'd be happy to do that. So thank you for watching this video. I wish you the best of luck in whatever you choose to do, whatever career path. And like I said, I hope you found this helpful. So I'll see you next time, or rather you'll see me, and have a wonderful day. Bye.